Day before yesterday, I tried this presentation, and actually my wife told me that I'm moving like a chicken with its head cut off. Yeah, actually in this stage I don't have the opportunity to do that, so it's lucky. Anyway, my presentation will be about contract testing. So let's start with this session a little bit interactively. It's already late, but let's try it. So please raise your hand if you have heard of contract testing before. Oh, quite a lot of people. And a few who have actually implemented contract testing or did something with contract testing. Also quite a few guys. I hope I will give you some useful thoughts for the ones who have did something with contract testing and also for the others. I think it's a quite good thing, so I hope the presentation will somehow reflect that. Well, the agenda of today, I will start with a little story, which obviously in a normal problem where contract testing would be an efficient tool. Then I will define contract testing, first of all, from management perspective. Then I will take a look at deep into the details. So I will find the more complicated scenarios regarding contract testing. Then I will take a look at the benefits and the typical use cases. And last but not least, I have some words about technologies and pipeline integration. So let's start with the little story. So imagine you have a system under test and you want to release it. You have received it, but it's not working. I think with most of you, it's an experience, so you have seen this before. Yeah, this is a very problematic stuff because there can be a lot of issues. It can be a deployment problem, it can be a security glitch, or it can be an integration problem. These kind of issues are quite bad because you need to be very good to solve it. It's not always very easy to figure out what is the issue actually. And it's also time consuming. And if you want to do a release, time consuming is a big issue. But for integration testing, we have possible way to automate. So why do we don't do integration test, or we do? Why don't we do enough? Actually, because integration testing, the traditional one, is not easy. First of all, it's quite complex. So to implement an integration test, you need to know the domain, you need to know how the security is working, you need to have a deployed entity, so a lot of things. Moreover, it's fragile because of the same reason. Any of the project component is not working, your integration test won't work. And it's not definitely an integration issue. It can be another problem. And last but not least, it's not trivial to implement. I wouldn't say that integration testing is a very difficult thing, but actually it's not the easiest one from implementation perspective. So the question obviously is there a way to do it easier? And I believe yes, in this session, I want to speak about this possible easier way. So, contract testing, first of all, some words from management perspective. So first of all, our aim is to ensure inter-system compatibility. So we are in integration testing level. Obviously, it's an alternative for integration testing, so I wouldn't be in other places. I have drawn here a testing pyramid. I've done it because, first of all, testing pyramid I think is very important thing, and to understand actually where we are. So integration test is a relative high-level testing. So you are actually validating that different components or different systems can work together. Most of them you are doing for technical perspective. Sometimes you are doing business-driven tests also, but in most of the cases, you want to validate whether your system as a whole is working. Last but not least about types, I will define them, but we have consumer-driven contract testing and producer-driven contract testing. So let's go into the details. So it's a technique that ensures the different components of a system or different systems can work together. It's aimed to validate the interaction between the system. Okay, it's normal integration stuff. What is the difference? The key concept a little bit different. So you have the consumer, which you normally have. the system which actually do the queries to the provider which is providing the right service. So you have an endpoint, you want to test the endpoint, and you have the consumer and the provider. The provider provides the endpoint, the consumer tries to use it. The difference is the contract. So you not want to explicitly try out the connection, but you write it down. So you can see it's a defined agreement that specifies the expected behavior, so the input, the output, the response time, the error condition. So you write it down. If I want to have a silly example, the difference between the traditional integration test and the contract testing is like having a phone call or sending a message. If you are doing the traditional integration test, you want to do the phone call. You have to have a lot of things up and running to have it. In contract testing, you don't. You are sending a message. It will once resolved. Actually, it's nowhere. It's maybe a too easy example, but you might understand the key concept. So let's jump into the type of contract testing. The first is provider-driven contract testing. This is the easier version of contract testing. Here you define the test cases on the provider side, you execute it against the provider, and actually, if the provider meets the expectation, then you will create a contract. And this contract will be used on the consumers. So you test the provider, you check whether the behavior of the provider is OK, and if it's OK, you create a contract and saying, OK, if you want to call that endpoint, this is how you can do it. On the other hand, consumer-driven contract testing is a little bit more complicated. So in this case, you define the test on the consumer side. So you define the test cases, you execute it, and you check whether the consumer is able to do the right queries. But we are not doing traditional tests, so we are not directly doing it against the provider, but we are doing against the mock. So what we are actually doing is that the consumer is sending requests to the mock, and we validate whether the communication is OK. If it's OK, then we create a contract, and this contract will be used for the provider test. So in the provider side, we validate whether the provider is working in a way how we defined it in the contract. Yeah. What you need to understand here, that actually I have drawn you the testing pyramid. Actually, consumer side is like a component test. However, the extra stuff that you are validating your mock. So it's typical thing on component test that you are validating something, but you are not sure whether the real world is working the way how you expect. Here, you validate it. This is which contract stands for. The difference between these two types of contract testing, maybe it's trivial, but let's explain it. So actually, in consumer-driven contract testing, it's a little bit more complicated. However, it makes more sense, because it's also validate that the consumer is able to do the right queries, not only check the provider. So in the provider-driven contract testing, it might be a possible scenario that you have the contract, but the consumer is just not able to do the right queries. However, in consumer-driven contract testing, you are also checking whether the consumer is able to do the right queries. Obviously, provider-driven contract testing is easier. Actually, it's more providing a living documentation, which is also very important. So with provider-driven contract testing, you can make sure how the provider is working. And there are scenarios where you don't know the consumer, or there are a lot of consumers. And in this case, provider-driven contract testing is a very good tool. But if it's possible, do the consumer-driven contract testing. It's more useful stuff. Yeah, whether you use provider or consumer-driven contract testing, you have a lot of benefits. The first and the most important one is local execution. So by contract testing, you are able to do the testing locally, which means that you don't need to have generic test account. You don't need to have a deployed system. So these are pain points normally in integration test. With deployment, there can be a lot of issue. If you want to have generic test account, you have to deal with the security department, and that can be tricky, because actually this is a kind of account which has a lot of privileges, and a lot of people might see it. So it's two very important stuff. Because of the same reason, so because of the local execution, these tests are more stable and faster. Because I have already mentioned that traditional integration test is fragile, because if the deployment goes wrong or if the security setup is incorrect, then your test won't work. However, in this case, it will. And also, the velocity is much better, because normally in traditional integration test, in most of the time, you are actually waiting for the response. In this case, you don't have to. And last but not least, the end product is more maintainable. So actually, the most important stuff here, that if you are doing something locally, it means that you can do almost in the same way how you're doing in a unit test. So you can debug it in an easier way, you will have feedbacks faster. So actually, the end product is something which is much easier to do something with it, to execute it, to debug it. So it's quite cool. Where are the typical use cases where you can use it? First of all, microservice integration. Obviously, microservice integration is a very, very good stuff, because actually you can release different functionalities in different life cycles. In some cases, it's much better than having the big monolith. However, from testing perspective, it can be an issue, because as a tester, you have to make sure that all the components are working together. For this, having a fast and reliable testing method is very, very important. Second is collaboration for coupled system. And it's not only for coupled system, it's also a good tool to force different teams to work together. Actually, I've implemented contract testing for a British client. And actually, the reason why they wanted to have contract testing is this. They want to force different teams to work together. I will have a slide about pipeline integration, and here you will see why it's a very, very good tool to force collaboration. And last but not least, obviously there are integration tests where traditional method is just not feasible. But contract testing is still possible. Technologies for contract testing. So you have a lot of framework for implementing contract testing. Actually, I've used PactNet, and this is the most known one, or I would say, I think it's the most known one. It's feasible for a lot of technologies. I have implemented in .NET, however, you can do it in Python, in Java, in a lot of other languages. You can use Spring Cloud or WireMock as well, and other services. This is only 3 examples. Which is maybe more exciting is pipeline integration. I have already told in the benefits that local execution is a very important stuff. In pipeline integration, it's even more important. So if you're implementing pipeline for for contract testing, and I think for test automation, pipeline is very, very important stuff, or better to say it's essential. No system deployment or generic test account required. It makes your work much easier. Because of the local execution, the end result is more stable. And last but not least, steps can be generalized in a more effective way. What does it mean? Actually, back to the example with this British client. I have implemented one generalized way for CI/CD in Azure DevOps, by the way, and actually I was able to use it for different projects. Actually, I only had to extend it. And this pipeline wasn't longer than 100 lines. So it was easy, and actually you can use it for several different projects, which is a quite good thing. And in traditional integration tests, you're normally not able to do that. How does it look like in the practice? So the green one is the consumer pipeline. So you execute, actually it's a consumer-driven contract testing, by the way. So you execute the consumer test. If the test execution was successful, you create the contract, you upload the contract. And on the blue side, so in the provider test, you download the latest or whatever you want contract, you execute the provider test, and if it's successful, then you can ensure that the integration test was successful. I told you that it's a good tool to enforce different teams to work together. Why am I saying that? Because if for both consumer and provider team, the merging criteria is to have the blue pipeline after every pull request. Then you can make sure that the integration is still working. And because of that, these teams have to speak, at least at the minimum level, to make sure that the integration is still working between these two teams. Yeah. So this is, I think this was the most essential thing. Yeah, here. Last but not least, summary. So I have spoken about contract testing. I've defined it, the basic stuff. I've told the key benefits, which is supporting microservice integration and collaboration. And you have a lot of technologies. Obviously, since from technological perspective, it's not a very difficult thing, actually. You can write your own framework, but I encourage to use a framework. Don't reinvent the wheel. It's always a bad practice. And actually, it's a very important stuff that pipeline integration is very, very efficient. So if you have a good generalized pipeline, you can do pipeline integration within days, which I think is a very, very important stuff. Yeah, actually, this was my presentation. So I'm waiting for the questions.
OK, so thank you, Matyas, for the presentation. Let's see the questions. So what is the difference between a contract and an API?
Actually, a contract contains much more information. So you can call an API, and you get a response. In a contract, you write down what is expected from an endpoint. So you write down if you expect HTTP 200, what should be the body in the response, what is the normal timeout, which is OK. So you write down more information. Actually, is more a definition of an API endpoint, with much more information. I hope it makes sense.
OK, thanks. The second question is, from your practice, is contract testing just complementary to integration testing, or one can exclude the other?
Yeah. Actually, where I've used it, it was a complementary for end-to-end testing, so not the traditional integration testing, but we had the UI tests, which actually it's a more end-to-end test, and we had the contract testing. So I think it can be excluded. So if I would have the possibility to do a project from the scratch, I would try to avoid integration tests as a whole, or if I do, I would only do minimal traditional integration tests just to make sure that the deployment as other stuff is working. But actually, I would do much more contract testing or only contract testing.
OK, there is a question with 9 likes at the moment from Dennis. So what tools and frameworks can be used to implement consumer-driven contract testing in the industry?
Yeah. Actually, if we go back to this slide, yeah, actually these are actually examples for this. For example, you can use PACT. There is a version where you have to pay, and there is a freeware version. The paid version, they give you the CI/CD implementation as well, but maybe, hopefully, the manufacturer of that tool is not there, because I don't recommend it, because pipelining is easy, I think. So you can use PACT, you can use Spring Cloud Contract, WireMock, and actually there are other tools. So if you have a quick search, you will find relatively a lot of tools, like Hypertest or so on. But actually, I recommend PACT. PACT has a very big community, and actually, PACT as a tool is quite good, and not only in way of contract testing, but actually its debugging console is quite good. Its logging is quite straightforward. So you can do it very, very easy way, and you can implement it in a very generalized way.
OK, the next question is from Peter. Testers or developers should write and maintain these tests?
Should it make sense? Actually, I think both parties can write it. And actually, what I think that there It depends on the project. That would be my short answer. Actually, from implementational perspective, contract testing is easy. So I think that most of the testers can write it even if you have not coded a lot. But actually, it's also a good stuff for developers because according to my experience, developers don't like integration tests because it's fragile. So they have to work and maintain these tests a lot. When I first implemented contract testing, I have given it to developers, and the developers first hated that. Okay, something new, they have to learn it. But after they got used to it, they started to like it because they have seen that it's not as messy as doing integration tests. So actually, I can't really answer this question. I think it depends. And actually, in test automation, my answer is always that. So maybe it's better if testers write it, but it's all the same. It depends on the project.
Okay, one last question. This is also interesting for me because I also have a lot of experience in testing, but contract testing was new for me. So how can we decide if we need contract testing?
Yeah, difficult question. Actually, I think if you have integration issues, and most of the projects have some integration issue, then it's a good thing to do contract testing. So actually, maybe I say too much actually, but so it's quite easy to do it, and because of that, I recommend in a quite lot of use cases. So I had here 3 typical use cases: microservices, collaboration, and infrastructural challenges. Basically, I recommend it for these 3 scenarios. However, in most of the project, one of these scenarios exists. If integration is not a problem in your project, then obviously forget about contract testing. It's just one more tool which you should know about, or I don't know whether you should know about. But whether you have integration problem, I think contract testing is something which you should think about whether you want to solve it in this way.